Hi everyone, it's Dave, and I'm back with another episode of Zilog and Moto. Today's episode is one of those episodes that I really enjoy doing because it's for a game I've never played before the past week. I've never rented it, never played it at a friend's house, never played it on an emulator, and I've never even seen footage of it, I don't think. I don't even remember reading a review of it in a magazine back in the day. However, I probably did, and it just didn't leave an impression. But my whole point is that this game is one of the games that, by virtue of collecting and reviewing all these titles for the channel, is a completely new experience for me. Honestly, before this week, you could have shown me a screenshot of this game, and I would have no idea what title it was for. So, that new experience is something that I really enjoy, even when it's a title like Andre Agassi Tennis was last week, that ends up being an absolute turd of a game. It's hard to explain. I don't think I'd ever play a bad game that I knew was a bad game on purpose for fun, but when I'm learning about things that I clearly missed 30 years ago, it feels like I'm filling in the blanks a little bit. But enough about all that. What about this week's mysterious game? Well, it's a game that features a team of individuals with X and mutants in the title, so it's obviously something related to a Marvel Comics property involving the X-Men, right? Well, yes and no. So, first off, despite how this cover art looks, Ex-Mutants doesn't have anything to do with the X-Men. And in fact, it's called Ex-Mutants because the team is made up of normal human beings that were reverted into human form. Hence the term Ex-Mutants. And as far as it being related to a Marvel property, well, it is, but only because Marvel bought Malibu Comics outright on November 3rd, 1994. So technically, when Ex-Mutants was released for the Genesis during the 1992 Christmas season, it was still solidly a Malibu comic property and not related to Marvel at all. So what is Ex-Mutants all about if it's not some 10th tier X-Men title that only sells when Wolverine or Deadpool guest stars? Well, it clearly appears to have been named as a poke at the X-Men titles. John Byrne famously did something similar at Dark Horse with a title called Next-Men after working on X-Men, but there was no Genesis game made about that property. Ex-Mutants, from what I can tell, as I never purchased any of those titles back when I collected, can be split into two eras. The early, very independent era consisted of the title bouncing back and forth between a few different publishers, but with a core story following 4 women and 1 man who had been turned back into humans after nuclear war had destroyed the planet and mutated everyone. And the story follows their adventures back into the shattered Earth. Malibu then purchased Eternity Comics, whom the title was primarily published by, and decided in 1992 to revamp the series, keeping the overall plot the same, but changing the characters around a bit, and evening up the team to 3 women and 3 men. From that comic book background comes a very comic book styled action game. The gist of the story is that due to the events that take place prior to the game, 4 of the Ex-Mutants have been taken captive by Sluggo, a not-so-imaginatively named bad guy that I also assume is represented in the comics. Your job is to take Ex-Mutants Aykroyd or Shannon, who both play slightly differently and start out with different attributes, and then rescue the rest of the team from Sluggo's minions before an eventual showdown with Sluggo himself. Sounds like a pretty good setup for an action game. And comic books do tend to lend themselves to being good backgrounds to video games. But is it actually any good? Because having a decent story will definitely only get you so far. Well, we shall find out, but first, a look at the package. Okay, this is Ex-Mutants, and immediately you'll notice that's in a classic style Genesis cover, as it still features the black border format, inset with a pretty cool shot of the Ex-Mutants, and their nice looking logo down at the bottom. One thing you might be wondering is, since this game was done by Malibu Interactive, why is the cover in the Sega first party format? And that's because apparently the game was supposed to be published by Sage's Creation, whom you might know from Sector X, Crackdown, and Kajiki, but their parent company Hot B ended up going bankrupt, so Malibu took the title to Sega instead, who decided it was a good enough title for them to publish. This is different than the release of Dinosaurs for Hire, also based on a Malibu Comics title, but in that case Sega developed the game internally, rather than Malibu Interactive having anything to do with it. I'd be curious to know why Malibu let Sega develop that title, rather than them do it themselves, but maybe it was a case of them wanting to strike while the comic was still popular, and they were busy with other more important releases like Batman Returns and Cliffhanger. Anyway, moving on, this cover graphic is a cleaned up version of the cover from Ex-Mutants #1 of the Malibu Comics run. I'll insert it here so you can see the comparison, but basically they changed the background so it would pop more against the black border, and then cleaned up some of the detail on the characters. I think it's a pretty great cover, solid art, and I definitely prefer the classic black borders versus the later red ones, or even the PAL releases that don't have borders at all. Looking at the characters' outfits, it's hard to not draw comparisons to the X-Men, with Shannon in the back wearing the Wolverine brown and orange, and Aykroyd in the front in the yellow and blue. But that's just me nitpicking a bit. Image Comics, specifically Rob Liefeld, certainly did a lot worse ripping off his own X characters. As far as the actual case goes, it's in pretty good shape. There's two pretty noticeable divots on the front cover, with one at the top going deep and damaging the inner cover a bit, but other than that, it's intact with minimal scratching, and the hang tab hasn't been removed, which is always nice. Also, other than the previously mentioned damage to the inner cover on the front, the rest of the inner cover is in good shape with no water or sun damage. Flipping over the back, and this is definitely one of the simpler layouts I've seen. Not necessarily bad, just not a whole lot going on here. I do like the coloring though, no boring plain white backgrounds here. And I like the tag at the top, Destroy the Mutant Menace. The screenshots are a decent quality, but in a pretty unique setup, they're angled with drop shadow to try to give them a bit of a 3D look. Points for originality anyway. Opening the box up, and the cartridge as usual is in good shape, but the manual is a little worse from the wear. Not bad, just a little bent up. It's got an advertisement for Shakan on the back. I always thought it was cool when they did that, rather than just being dead space. There's not a bunch to the manual, as you can see it's kinda thin. That doesn't mean it's bad though. In fact, it's just the opposite. The game is fully explained, and there's all sorts of pictures from the game, especially the power-ups, so you clearly know when you're playing what's on the screen. Also, at the end, there's a nice description of each of the levels in the game, so you have an idea of where you're at and what's still in store for you as you progress through the game. Okay, well that's the package. Let's take a deeper look at the game and see if it's anything more than a run-of-the-mill 16-bit action title. Side-scrolling action titles in the 8 and 16-bit era usually share some main features with one another that are common throughout the genre. Sometimes, especially in more primitive titles, you can only progress in one direction, either going from left to right or right to left, and once you've started to move in that direction, if you've missed something off screen, it's gone forever. This tends to be more common in games that are closer to what we'd call traditional platformer. But there's also a subgenre of side-scrolling action titles that tend to have more maze-like characteristics, where there's not necessarily one direction through the level, and if you don't fully explore the levels, you may miss certain items or weapon power-ups. This subgenre has come to affectionately be called Metroidvanias in recent years, as an amalgamation of the names Metroid and Castlevania, with games like Super Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night being the gold standard of this type of game. Games on the 8 and 16-bit Sega consoles that can claim to be a part of this subgenre are few and far between. So imagine my surprise when I boot up Ex-Mutants, and as I go to start the first level, I'm greeted with Professor Kildare, the cyborg who rescued the Ex-Mutants, showing me a zoomed out map of the lab and accompanying nearby cave system that I would proceed to navigate through. And sure enough, as I started to play the level, it became very quickly apparent that while there was a logical direct path through the level, there were certainly rooms and paths that I could take that weren't part of that path, with some even having their entrances hidden, requiring you to explore a bit if you wanted the power-ups that you could see, but were just out of reach. Also, my son even walked in while I was playing the game to record the video for the review, and completely unprompted said that it looked like Castlevania. While the game does have a decided level structure that's more in line with standard platformers, whereby once you finish a level you can't go back to it, or would need to unlock certain power-ups, if you finish a level without finding the battery cell hidden in each level, the good professor will send you right back where you exited to find it before you're allowed to move on. I could see how some people might not like that, but I do, and it really gives the player an extra incentive to thoroughly explore the levels versus just trying to blaze through the game as fast as possible. Picking up items in the levels is critical to progressing through the game, and lends itself to specifically the Castlevania comparisons, a little more so than Metroid, as you don't ever permanently gain weapon upgrades. You have to either pick up shot upgrades which come with limited ammo, or special weapons such as grenades and mines, where you can only have one type of special weapon at a time, and when you come to another one, you have to make a decision as to which to pick up and carry based on what you think will be the most useful to you or your particular playstyle. Adding a bit of variety here, shot upgrades are different depending on whether you play as Aykroyd or Shannon, with Aykroyd being able to choose between throwing single axes or 3 knives, and Shannon being able to throw sticks based on her nunchucks in a similar pattern. When you die, you lose with the items you've collected, and you'll have to pick them up again, meaning that if you're near a secret area that requires an explosion to get in, you may just be SOL, or if you'd picked up the power cell for the professor, you'll have to go back and grab it again before being able to exit the level. I like the variety that the game has here, as certain sections will play differently depending on the items that you have, and the possibility of losing them when you die definitely gives you an added incentive not to, even if you happen to have extra lives to burn at the moment. Being that the game is based on a comic book, it also has significant comic book tendencies to its storytelling method. In other words, you're not just playing a video game that features characters from a comic book, there's an actual story here that relates to what's going on the screen. Before each level, there's a good bit of on-screen dialogue with large drawn faces of the characters representing them talking to one another. The dialogue can be skipped if you wish, if you've seen it before, or you can hold down a button to at least make it appear on the screen quicker. I like the extra story included here, and you can see that Malibu Interactive was trying to rely on their strengths and comic book company background. Also, when you die and only have 1 life left, your character will appear on the screen with one of these dialogues and either taunt you or implore you to play better, which I thought was a nice touch. The story and dialogue certainly isn't anything special, and some lines are decidedly campy, as you might expect from a comic book, but there's still a bit of a charm to it, and it gives the other characters in the game that you don't play as something to do other than just be rescued. So far, you're probably thinking, hey, this game sounds pretty good, or I wonder why it wasn't a bigger release and more in demand. Well, as with anything, a good concept and design will only get you so far. However, like we saw previously with other Malibu Interactive efforts like Cliffhanger or 3 Ninjas Kick Back, ideas and overarching design only get you so far, and you still have to follow through and make a game that's fun to play. Having said that, Ex-Mutants does start out pretty fun. As you navigate the laboratory and make your way into the caves, there's lots of dangers to avoid, like various enemies, laser guns that fire at you, and buzzsaws and lava as you make it further into the cave. And for that beginning portion, the gameplay, as simple as it is with lots of emphasis on timing your movements, makes sense and is enjoyable. However, things start to fall apart once you reach the first boss, who appears at the end of the 3rd level. He's not difficult if you're patient, but the game has what I would call a flaw that really starts to get exposed here. In most platformers or action games, when you have a life bar with a certain amount of hits you can take before you die, if you take a hit, you will have a few seconds of invincibility before you take damage again, giving you a chance to readjust your positioning on the screen so you don't get hit. Ex-Mutants doesn't allow for that, requiring you to be very deliberate in your movements on the screen, and preventing you from being aggressive in your approach to the levels. The reason why I mention the first boss specifically is because you have to hit him about 40 times to defeat him. Meanwhile, you only have 8 hits that you can take if you're playing as Aykroyd, and only 6 if you're playing as Shannon to survive. And one of the boss's attacks will hit you 3 times if you make a mistake and allow yourself to be hit. You can see the problem here, and this just gets worse the further you make it into the game. I finally made it to the second boss of the jungle area before pulling up the game's cheat menu to skip it, because of how impossible it seemed, and then got stymied again by the enemies in the first sewer area. Having tiny bats be able to drain all your health away in quick fashion while you're seemingly unable to hit them due to their position on the screen isn't fun at all. It's too bad too, because the game actually has very responsive controls, but it feels like that one little tweak would have made all the difference in the world. And what's worse, if you read the manual, it looks like the designers knew this was an issue and supposedly included extend items that would add 2 hit points to your life.
but I played through 2/3 of the game and I didn't find a single one. So either they are incredibly well hidden, or they forgot to actually put them in the game. Having said all that, without being able to find and pick up those life extensions, playing the game as Shannon is virtually impossible with only having 6 hit points, defeating the purpose of having a second character to try to play with. The graphics are where this game really shines, and that's something to be expected being a title from a company that has a comic book background. The animations on all the characters, especially Aykroyd and Shannon, are very smooth. None of the sprites in the game are very large, and that probably contributes to how well the game runs, but I don't want to ding it for that too much, because even though they're on the smaller side, they're still detailed. Even with the Genesis 64 color on-screen limitation, the game never feels too bland, and you don't have segments where just everything seems brown or some other color. Also, there's some very nice use of parallax scrolling in levels where there's a background layer that has a completely different art than the section you're in, giving the game a great sense of depth. There's even some nice transparencies, specifically on the log level between the jungle and sewers, where fog will float through and sometimes obscure what's on screen partially. This isn't something you see a lot on the Genesis, so it's definitely worth mentioning. The sound in game is a bit of a mixed bag. Some of the music's pretty good and fits the levels well, but then in other places it just sounds plodding and not well composed. For example, some of the synths used to create the music simply sound bad. So while the tune of the music is fine, it doesn't come across as enjoyable. However, while the music doesn't always work, the sound effects in the game are pretty great. Explosions explode, splat splat, and electricity abounds. Along with the solid sound effects, Aykroyd and Shannon both feature in-game speech. They don't act out their dialogue from the story sections, mind you. However, that would have been really cool if this game had gotten a Sega CD version. But at points during gameplay, they each have a few celebratory sayings that usually get shouted out when you dispatch a foe. The speech isn't perfect, but I've heard far worse attempts, and it achieves the desired effect of briefly pumping you up as you play. All in all, Ex-Mutants is a game that I really wanted to like. Yes, the story has some cheesiness to it, but again, what do you expect? It's based on a comic book. And if the rest of the game stayed like the early levels, I could have put up with its lack of invincibility frames, and just chalked it up to being difficult. And I may well go back to Intuit and try and beat it at some point, possibly using the game's very useful built-in cheat screen. But for now, I've got to move on, and just like how Marvel hasn't seen fit to produce any new Ex-Mutant stories in the last 26 years, I've got to spend my time playing other games. Having said all that, I'm giving Ex-Mutants 2 stars out of 5. There's certain things that the game does very well, but when a game becomes a chore to play rather than fun, I've got to take away points.
Okay, that was Ex-Mutants. When I first started to play Ex-Mutants, I was really hopeful that I had stumbled upon a diamond in the rough that somehow had just been criminally ignored all these years. But a few hours in, I'd figured out that it wasn't an in-demand title on the resale market for a reason. Oh well, they can't all be Cool Spot or Forgotten Worlds. Tune in next week as I turn my sights back to the Master System. I'll be looking at yet another game that I've never played before, at least this specific version, and it's actually one of the title that's near and dear to Pat the NES Punk's heart, even though it's clearly not a release for a Nintendo-related system, and instead is actually one of the few American Master System releases that comes from a third party, in this case Taito. I'm really curious to see what all the hubbub is about, and if I'll agree with Pat or not. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.